So this week we'll be talking about responsive design. We'll look at a few components and add some CSS to our website. So we'll start with the Flexbox. Flexbox is a relatively new CSS rule, sort of like CSS Grid, which allows you to kind of lay things out either horizontally or vertically, and then kind of make them move within certain parameters. So we'll do that first because that will be affected by our responsive layouts. Our layouts will use media queries, so we'll be moving stuff around a bit. And then we'll finish with some typography, very simple. As I'm kind of going over these examples, things may apply to your site a little differently than how they apply to my site. But the sites should be more or less the same at this point. So, you can change things if you are wanting to, if you want something to look different. Feel free to go off of what I'm doing. The things that we want to have by the end of this are a style sheet for the responsive.css, which will control the views for mobile and tablet. And then we also want a menu.css, which I'll go into during the demo, and a create.css as well for the create page. So I'll get started with the Flexbox. But all of these things kind of work together to make our site change depending on different environments. So different browsers, different browser sizes, different devices, different device sizes. So we'll talk about how those figure into our design process as I go through these new concepts. So we're going to start with the Flexbox. I'm going to start there. I'm also going to be applying some of these rules to our project. So I'll kind of be going back and forth. So I'm going to go ahead and open up GitHub and get started with a new project. So I'm on the MMP 350 repo. I'm going to click open in Sublime Text so that we have our page ready. And then I'm also going to click Show in Finder. So here's MMP 350. And I'm just going to make a copy of the storage folder. So that's the last project that we did, adding images to our posts and our profiles. So I'm going to duplicate the storage folder so we can get started with a new project. And then I'll duplicate the storage project. I'm just going to hit Command D to duplicate. You can also do Command C and Command V on Windows or Mac, or you can just do duplicate from the context menu, or you could do copy and then paste. So I'm going to rename this copy to responsive. That's what we're going to be working on this week, and then go over to Sublime. And I'm just going to add a link in here. So here's the last link to the last project we added, the storage project. I'm just going to add a new list item, anchor tag, and this is going to be called responsive, and we'll just put responsive here for the link, and so we're ready to go with that. So I'm going to close this and just open up the Sublime server, and so with the Sublime server open, I can go over to my browser, go to localhost 8080. Let's make sure that's running. Sublime server. Okay, start Sublime server. Okay, so with the Sublime server running, I can go to MMP 350, go to responsive. So here's our site. You can see some tests happening. Looks like people have been working on adding some posts. So I'm gonna log out because we're gonna be starting with the menu. And so I'm gonna start with this area here, the login section. And we're gonna kind of move that into a different area so we can apply a Flexbox. So that's what we'll use to sort of test our Flexbox rules. And so to do that, I'm actually gonna update my layout a little bit. And this will actually be a good chance to kind of review some of the layout stuff and kind of remember where all of our CSS is. So I'm going to open up responsive and go to index.html and just scroll down a bit. And we're going to start looking at this login section. We're going to make some changes in here to update our design. And then I'm going to open up style.css, make sure I have this ready to go. And then I'm going to change my layout a little bit. I'm just going to go to my layout And I'm going to update this first to use grid template areas. I think this is going to be a lot easier, both for responsive and for Flexbox to kind of move our layout around without having to think too much about the grid, the CSS grid. So if you prefer using the numbers like column start, column end, etc., like these numbers that you see here, you can still do that, but I think using the grid areas is going to simplify things when it comes to doing our layouts. So I'm just going to convert this really quickly into a new layout. So I'm going to open up my Elements tab over here and just take a look at what I've got here. So with this grid, I basically have my title section right here, my login section here, the post section here, and then the main content is here. And that pretty much stays the same like if I go to the user profile page or other pages. So I'll stick with that basic layout with my columns and the same grid gap, everything else. But I'm going to change from using like the grid column start and end to just using some template areas. So if I wanted, and I'm also going to move this menu up to the top right here. So the menu will be on top. That way it'll be easier to show off what the Flexbox is really useful for. So first I'm going to make my grid areas. So I'm going to say grid template areas. And so just kind of a review, we did this a few weeks ago. So for each area, we have two columns. We have this 2 fraction column and this 1 fraction column. So we need to have 2 columns in each row of our template. So the top row is just going to be the menu. So do menu twice. So that'll fill up the whole top row. And then for the bottom row, or for the second row, we'll start our main content here, and then we'll use the title right there. So I'm going to say main content. And so I'm also going to use slightly different terminology than last time, just to kind of review that we can use whatever terms we want and then place different things into those areas. So I'll use main and then title. And then I'll continue with the main content on the third row, but in the second column on the third row, I'm going to use, that's where I'll put the publish section. And then on the last one, I'm just going to put another main and then nothing here, just to make sure that our main content gets enough space. And so now I can get rid of all these kind of long rules, and I can just replace this whole thing with grid area and then match this. So grid area title goes to the title right here. User info is part of the menu, so we'll just say grid area menu. That's the second part of the menu that we'll do. We're starting with the login. So that grid area is also menu. And then the publish post goes to publish. So I'll just say grid-area publish. And then finally, the profile and the posts on their separate pages are really the main content. So I'm just going to call this grid area main. So now the grid areas really describe the area of the page rather than the content, and then we put the content where it makes the most sense. So the login goes into the menu, the user info goes into the menu, the profile goes into the main grid area, the posts go into the main grid area. The only thing that's sort of not going to be on every page is our publish section, so we may change that at some point, like we could call that the sidebar or something. For now, I'll just leave it as is. So I'm going to refresh the page. And so now we can kind of see our new layout. Doesn't look too bad. But basically this menu section up here is taking up a lot more space than it needs to. So we can really do better by using all this space over here. So we can start by moving this up here, or we could move these guys over. And the Flexbox is really going to be useful for doing that. So I'm going to create a menu style sheet, so I can add some rules for this, and then after that, I'll get into the Flexbox rules. So in style.css, I have to remember to add this. So I'm going to say import css/menu.css, and then I'm just going to create a new file. So I'll hit Command N and save as, and go to CSS, and this is menu.css. And so we'll start with the login section. So we don't actually have like a menu div because we are going to have different parts of our layout that go into the menu. So we'll just start with this login area. So I'm just going to say login here. And so here's where we're going to start to add our flexbox. So let's go back to our notes and take a look at how to set up the flexbox. So I'm going to just put this into this view. Okay, so the flexbox is used to lay out elements either horizontally or vertically. So it's used in conjunction with the CSS grid. So any part of our page that we need to lay out just a single area, we can apply a flexbox to. So a flexbox is a little bit different with the grid, which looks at the page as a whole, or different sections as a whole. The flexbox really only works with one line of elements, either going horizontally or vertically. So I'm going to kind of go through the rules and then update what we have in our project as we look at them. To start, we have two parts of our flex rules. We have the parent and we have the children. There's a really good tutorial on CSS tricks flexbox, which kind of goes over this, which I linked to later in the notes. But they have it basically divided into the two sides. You can see the rules for the parent and the rules for the children over here and how they relate to each other. So this is a really convenient and useful tutorial here that goes into a lot more detail than I really will have time to go into. So I'll put a link to this in the YouTube and the notes as well. So let's go back and add our first flex rule. So that's the flex container, sort of like display as grid. We're just going to just say display as flex. I have like a little menu section in the notes, but we're just going to be looking at the menu that we have on our project. So this is a menu display block. You can see the elements of the menu just kind of go one after the other because they extend all the way to the end of each row in our HTML. If we change this to flex, now our elements sit next to each other. So that's kind of that's the basic thing that a flexbox will do, is it'll change the default flow of the CSS to whatever you want it to be. So I'm gonna just say for the login, display is flex, and reload the page. And so now you can see the immediate change that happens is our content is all sitting next to each other. And so there's a couple undesirable things happening that we'll fix as we look at this. One of the main things that is a problem here is this paragraph, which has, where is that? Right here. So this paragraph has some margin on the top and the bottom, which is why our button and our inputs are much taller than they should be. So we can fix that really easily just by getting rid of that margin. So with the flexbox, all the elements are kind of being laid out together, so their height is going to affect each other. So I'm just going to add a new rule and say login paragraph and just say margin is 0. So we can just fix that real quick. Okay, the other issue is that there's no space in between our elements, but we're going to look at a lot of different ways to fix that as we look at our rules. So that's our first basic flex box. You can see the login display as flex, and we really haven't added any other rules to the flex box at this point. So we just basically get a line of our content of our elements in the flex box. So that's our flex box container, and then our flex box children are all of the sort of first elements inside. So this input, the button, this paragraph. This paragraph has an anchor tag inside of it. So the paragraph is a child, but the anchor tag is not. So we can add flex rules to any of these child elements. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Okay, so that's our first container rule. We can actually do a lot with just some simple rules in the flexbox. So the justify content rule kind of lays out the content horizontally. So flex start just means that the content starts at the beginning over here. If we change that to flex end, all of our content moves over here. So that's pretty cool right from the beginning. It used to be, kind of a pain in the butt to be able to move content like that very easily. So now it's much easier using the flex justify content. If If we do center, then we get the center content, space between. That's going to put an even amount of space in between each one of our elements. That's nice for a menu like this. It's probably not going to look great for our menu, but we'll take a look at that in a second. Space around adds a little bit of space around each element. So it's sort of similar to space between, except space between goes up to the edges of the box. And then space evenly just spaces all of the elements evenly across the page. So let's add that to our menu and see how it looks. So this goes in the container element, the login. So we'll say justify content. And so some of the flex rules don't actually contain the word flex in them, but we can just remember which ones work together. So flex start is the sort of default here, flex dash start. And so if we put that rule there, it's not going to change anything at all. Okay, so that's just normal. Okay, flex end will move everything to one side. So that's actually kind of nice. It might be nice if this create new account was actually like over here, then you'd have the login on the left and it could line up, or sorry, the right, it could line up with this button down here. So that's something that we could shoot for, which we can actually do pretty easily. One thing is the flex content, you can change the order of these elements, but you can also just move the elements around. So we'll look at both of those in a moment. Or that's flex end. Then we have center. Okay, so that'll just put everything in the middle. That might be useful in some cases, probably not really right here. Space between. Okay, so that is the one where we have flush on the edges over here and then space in between the elements. This isn't really going to work for us since our main content is this login section, so we're probably not going to use that. There's space around. Okay, so that just adds a little bit of space to the edges here. And there's space evenly, which is kind of similar, but we're just adding a little bit more margin space over here and compensating for the space in here. So let's actually just go with our flex end. I kind of like that look, and then we'll look at different ways to move this login over here. So we can either change the HTML or the CSS. There's a few different ways to do it, but we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so that's another one of our container rules. Align items is how we align items on the opposing axis. So that's a little confusing, but basically if your items are going like this, 1, 2, 3, 4 horizontally, then the align items is how they are laid out vertically. And in the opposite case, which we may not work with today, but you can with a flexbox align your items like this, and then in that case the align items would be horizontal. So we can look at that here with our menu. So if flex start is just going to be kind of the default, flex end is going to move them actually to the top. Center will center them. That's probably going to be the most convenient one. Baseline will use the text as a baseline. And then stretch is going to stretch the elements across. So we can see how that will affect our layout. So this one, you probably don't really need to use that often, but it can be useful. So align items. So the default is flex start. Probably won't see any change here. Although you do see, so that login button moved up because there's a little bit of space there. So now everything is aligned upwards. If we do flex end, see everything move down. So both the login button moved down and this paragraph moved down as well. If we do center, so now everything is centered. The buttons, the login, all that stuff is centered across. What was the other one? Stretch. So stretch will stretch everything to fit the height. Whoops. And so that's actually kind of nice because now the button is the same size as the input, and our paragraph also takes up the same size. So that might actually be kind of useful. Maybe we'll leave it as stretch. And then the last one is baseline. So that one is kind of similar to center, but it's looking for the text rather than the height. So I kind of like stretch there. We might get rid of that later, but for now I'm going to leave that as stretch. You guys can put whatever you prefer there. So that's another container rule. And then the wrap tells us whether or not we can wrap content. And we're actually going to see a pretty useful thing for this in a bit. For now, I'm just going to, we're not going to actually see this happen if I say flex wrap is wrap. We don't have enough content. This is if like your content gets too big. So we can kind of create that by moving here. You can see that that create a new account moves to the next line. That's because the flex wrap is there. If I turn the flex wrap off, then it's going to start to fit our content. It's going to squeeze together. So it's probably good to have flex wrap off at this point, or sorry, flex wrap on at this point before we write media queries. But we are going to write some media queries that will kind of help us with this issue in a bit. So I'm going to leave flex wrap the way it is for now. We don't really need it right now, but when in a little bit we're going to add some more rules to deal with our sort of email address or this error message that comes up here. So that's obviously not a very good place for it. So we'll use some other rules to place that somewhere else. So that's wrap. And there's also wrap reverse, which basically changes the order that it wraps in. So probably won't need to use that, but maybe we'll see at some point. So then align content aligns the entire group rather than the individual items. So you can see this is the default flex align content flex start. And so if I change that to flex end, so with our align content, we're working in the opposite direction. So if our main content is going this way, the align has to do with the opposite direction. So stretch will kind of stretch everything across. Flex end will move to the end. Center will center everything. Space between. So it kind of does everything that the justify content does, but in the opposite direction. So we really only have one line of content that we're dealing with here, so we're not going to worry too much about that. So that's something that you may need if you have like a menu with a lot of items in it, but we're not going to spend too much time on that right now. So we can also change the flex direction, and we don't really want to do this right here, but I'll just show what that means. So if I say flex direction, and I say row versus column. So row is what we've been looking at. Everything aligns in a row horizontally. If we go to row reverse, then it is still in a row, but it's going backwards. Okay, that might be useful. Actually, that's something we could do to get this guy over here, but then we'd have a different order for our elements. Then column is actually going to change everything to go this way. So all of the rules are going to flip from being horizontal to vertical. So we might look at that more when we do our media queries if we need to, but for now I'm going to leave that alone. So here's an example where we see everything applied with a flex column in the opposite direction. So it's a little bit hard to see everything, but the flex wrap, so if we wrap, we'll see that affects the opposite direction. Justify content is now horizontal. So if we center, space between, space around, space evenly. Now align items is actually working vertically. So that's the opposite of what we had before. Align content is working horizontally as well, although we're not seeing that update, so there might be an error there. So we're probably not going to use that too much right now, but just as a reference, it's there. So now let's add some rules to our flex items. Okay, so flex grow. This is actually going to determine how much space our flex items take up. And there's a default here. So if we look at our login section, each of our flex items is taking up the same amount of space. Okay, so by default, they don't get more space than each other. If we start to add to that, then we'll see we can make our items take up different amounts of space. So one way to test this real quick is to add in some of our items. So we have the login email, login password, login button, and then our two paragraphs. And I'm going to give an ID to this paragraph right here just to make it easier to use. So if I take those guys in, and you guys don't have to copy this because I'm just doing this as an example, but I'm just going to take all of these. So I'll just copy this whole thing, paste it over here, and I'll just use the IDs. So I'm just going to grab those IDs, delete everything else. Again, I'm not really going to use this in the final version, so don't worry about recreating this. I just want to show an example. So I'm going to put a little hashtag to get the ID there and commas to add them together. So if I say these are all flex grow is 1, now they are going to take up more space than they did before. So they're all being allowed to take up 1/4 of the entire space since there's 4 different items. If I then change, or sorry, one of our items is invisible, so there's 4 different items. So if I change one of those, like let's say I take our create link and change the flex grow to 2, now it's going to take up a little bit more space than everything else. So it has 2 versus everything else. If I push that number up, then it starts to take up more and more space. It basically adds up all those numbers and then divides them across the space that's available. We don't really need to use this much. This is for sort of more specific types of layouts, but for us, we're probably going to be able to avoid that completely. So we'll just stick with what we've got so far. But just so that we know. Okay, so here we have our home element is ID home, and then all of these are menu items. So if we change all the menu items to 2, nothing happens because they're all the same amount. If we change our home item to 2, now it grows a little bit. So there's now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 possibilities, and this one gets 2. So it's not twice as big as the other elements, but almost. And there's 3, and there's 4. So again, we're not going to use flex grow a lot, but it does exist. So the flex basis is the default size of an element. This is actually something we're going to use in conjunction with our wrap rule in a moment. But let's just take a look at what it does. So the flex basis, so if we say it's 100 pixels, they're all going to default to be 100 pixels. If we say 200 pixels, now they're all 200 pixels. If we say 2EM, they're a bit smaller, 50%, they're larger. Then we can change the home, and the home will now be 100 as the flex basis, where the rest of these guys are 50%. So it's gonna kind of have a target for what it should be, but it's not always going to be able to do it. Obviously, there's not enough space for each one of these elements to have 50%, so it ends up dividing these 3 evenly, and then the home only gets 100%. So we'll use the flex basis basically for a little trick in a little bit. So then there's the flex order, and this is how we can order our elements. So here, the order for each is 1, so it'll just go with 1, 1, 1 in the order of the HTML. If we change the home to 2, now it goes 1, 1, 1, 2. So it's a little weird. You don't have to have every single number, but basically if these are all 1, then it'll put them in order of the HTML. When we change this to 2, it moves it to the end. So if we move home to -1 or to 99, it has the same effect as our items. So that's one way that we could move our create link to a different part of our menu. So we could put in here create-link, and we could say order is -1. And so now the create new account will go to the left here. So that's one way we could do it. The other way we could do it is just changing the HTML. So I could just take the create link, pull it out of here, and drop it down there. So really either way, it doesn't matter that much. You might, if you're changing the CSS at some point with your JavaScript, that might be useful. But if you can just move the HTML, that might be a better way to do it, because then you can just change the HTML and basically get rid of an entire CSS rule. So that would be preferable in that case. But the order is there if you need to use it. Then we can align the elements by themselves. So here's the whole menu is flex start, so they're all at the top here, and then we can change just the home element to the end, center, baseline, stretch. So that's one way that we can change just one element's alignment without affecting the rest of the menu. So those are actually all the rules that have to do with the child elements. There's not as many as with our container, but we can kind of do a few different things. So now that we've gone through all the rules of the flexbox, let's finish our flexbox, and then let's move on to the next part. So one thing I could do to make this look a little bit better is I could move this create account over here, so it's not like right up against this. But then I would have to be kind of combining different things. So I would want to change this to flex start, but then everything is going to move to the left. So I'm going to show you guys a trick to fix that. So let's change this to flex start, which is really the default. So I could just delete this rule altogether, but I'm just going to leave it there. So if I want to move these guys over, one thing I can use is a default margin. So if I take this login button here, and I say login dash button, margin left is auto. So this isn't just a flex rule, but it has a nice effect on the flex box, which is it creates an automatic margin in between the left and the rest of the content here. And so you can see now the login is on this side of the page. But I can actually do that anywhere I want. So if I move that over here or even to here, then I'll move all of these items over here. So let's actually apply that to the email input instead, which is the login email. So that way we get our create new account text here, and then our login text here. And the create new account, this is also very large. I kind of want to make that smaller, and I want to show, I'm going to take the create link, and one example that you might run into is if we look at this create link, if I try to change the font size here, so if I say font size is, let's say 1 EM, notice that it doesn't update because the anchor tag is what is getting the actual font size, which is getting something from our typography page. So if I want to make that smaller, then I need to actually put the anchor tag there because that anchor rule is taking precedence. So now our create account is on the left, and so that looks pretty good. We might want to also add a little space in here, which we can do with another margin. So we can take our email and our password and just add a little margin there. So I'll say login-email, and then I'll also use the password, which is login password. And I'll say margin to the right this time is, let's just give it a little margin, 0.5 EM. Okay, and now we have a little space here, but since it's a flex box, this is still lined up on the left, on the right side, which is very nice. We get a little margin here, and we get our auto margin there. And that looks pretty good for our basic header. One thing I might want to do is align this paragraph. I thought I had line item stretch. Let's try center. Let's see if that fixes that. Okay, so that fixes the paragraph. So let's do this. I want to center my create link. So I'm just going to say create link. And this is actually a good use for that align item. So I'll say align self center. So it's going to be a little different than the rest of our flexbox, but now it's centered across here. So that looks pretty good. So I'm pretty happy with that. So now we have to fix our one last part, which is where does this part go? It kind of has more to do with this section than this section. So let's see if there's a way that we can move that over. So I'm going to go to the login message. I'm just going to create another rule here and say login message. And this is where we can use our flex basis as a little hack. So we can say flex basis. And if we say this is 100%, that will automatically push the paragraph down to the next row, even if there's no content in there. So now when we fill this in, we get this. Let's use some traditional old CSS and just say text align is right. And we can fix that right up. So now I'll just get rid of this rule. We don't need that anymore. And I'll just say some old school CSS text align is right. And we'll get this text on the right side of the screen. Okay, so now we get this error message. All right, so I think that's everything we need for our flex box. I also want to make sure to style the user info section using the flex box once we are logged in. And then we also want to go over to the create account and just add a simple flex box right here. And it looks like we need to update the layout here as well. Do the create account first, since that button will go away when we log in. So here's our create page. It's clear that we haven't really used this in a while, and it's kind of breaking our grid. So let's fix this up. So let's go to create.html. So we have the title, we have the user info, and then we have the sign up. We don't really need the user info because we never actually use that. So let's just delete that. So we just really need the title and the sign up. So the title should fit into the right place, but the sign up doesn't have a part in the grid, which is why our grid looks kind of broken. So let's fix that. So let's go to our layout page, and let's put our sign up in the main section. So we'll find that right here. So we can just add sign up. Is that what it's called? Yeah. So we'll just add that as one of our main areas. And so now this should match. So we do have a little bit of a weird thing where we have some grid space that's not being used. But this is a good start for the create page. Let's just finish this off by adding sign up to the flexbox. So I'm going to add a new CSS file to deal with this. So I'm going to say at import css/create.css. And so we can just specifically target that create page. So I'll make a new file, save this as responsive CSS create.css. And we're just going to make this flex. So we'll start off simple. We'll say ID sign up, display is flex. Let's take a look at that. Okay, so that sort of looks better, but we have this weird thing where all this content is the same size as the title. So let's see if we can fix that. So we should be able to fix that by using align items. So let's say align items is flex start. Okay, so that looks a little bit better, but we have this issue where our sign up button is not getting enough space. So let's try if we just add a wrap here. If we say flex wrap, it's wrap. Okay, and let's space out our input elements. Let's say justify content. We could say space between. Okay, so we're a little bit spaced out. And then let's just move that sign up button over. So we'll say sign up button. And we'll use our margin auto trick again. So I'll say margin left is auto. Okay, and then maybe we can center these guys as well. So instead of flex start for line items, let's try center. Okay, that looks a little better. So maybe we can also align the content. So we can say align content. We'll try that as center. Okay, that looks pretty nice actually, because now we're kind of aligned. So the username, email, sign up. That sign up is not very large, so let's make that button a little bit bigger. Let's say font size is 2em. Does that look too big? Yes. So let's try 1.5. Okay, so that looks good. Maybe our line content center doesn't really work anymore. What about baseline? No. Space around maybe? Okay, that looks good. Or space between. No, that's too much. Space evenly. Okay, that looks good. So we have the same issue here where if we create a user and we get an error, then we get this same problem here. So we have another element for that, the sign up message. And let's just use our same trick here. So we'll say sign up message. We'll say margin left. It's auto. And, or wait, no, let's use the other trick. So we'll say flex basis is 100%. And let's see, how does that look? 1, 2, 3. Okay, and let's also do the text align is right. So again, you guys can change your layout to fit how you prefer. But for now, this is going to be good enough for this. Once the user is able to create an account, we'll go back to the index page and they'll be logged in. So let's try logging in. I'm going to log in as b@b.com and log in. And so now the last thing we want to do is just add a little flex box to this user info. We can basically apply the same flex box that we have for our main menu, but then we can make a few changes. So let's go back to menu.css. And so where I have login, I'm just going to add user-info on top of this. So that way I don't have to rewrite all these rules. Okay, so now we have user info. But you can see it's actually not working right now because we have this display block in our auth section. So we have to be a little bit careful there. So let's open up the main.css. And here we have this whole authentication section. So we're only displaying the user info if the user logs in. But the problem with that is that we have it as display block. And what we want is flex. So let's grab this and just make a copy and change this to flex. And then I'll just remove it from this rule here. So now we can leave these guys as block and we can get this one as flex, but only when we're logged in. So that way we still have our display none. Okay, so now we're gonna have to make some changes here as well. So let's first make sure that this looks good. So our username, we want that text to be a bit bigger and we also can get rid of those paragraph margins. So let's go back to menu.css. And let's say user info p, so we'll get rid of that margin. Okay, that looks better. And then let's fix that text size. So let's see. We have a font size for the create link, but we want something bigger than that. So I'm just gonna find the ID for that. That's the username. So I'll copy that. So we'll say ID username. So let's say font size. Let's make it pretty big. So we can try 2EM. Yeah, that's not actually so bad. So we have a better font size there. So then let's see. We have this anchor here. Why is our button so large? Let's fix that. So let's change the button, which is the logout button. I'm gonna add that here and say log out button. So if we align self to center, now it's a more reasonable size. And let's also push that to the margin left. So I'm gonna say log out dash button. So I'm just kind of mixing and matching here. It's not necessarily the only way to do this, but it can kind of make it a little bit easier. And then we just have this anchor tag here, which we should center that. So let's see if we do align self center. Okay, that looks a little better. And let's see, what can we do? Let's just give it a margin to the left. We could do auto and then remove it from the logout button. Okay, but actually I want it to be close to the, oops. I do want it to be close to the user profile. So let's just say margin left is 1EM. Okay, so they'll be able to see that edit profile. And let's actually make that font a little smaller so it's not so large. Let's see, 1EM. Okay, that looks a little bit better. We could also put the user image there, but I don't really want to get ahead of myself. So let's just put those rules in. So that is our edit profile link. I'm just going to make a copy of that and I'll just put it down here. So what did I do? I said align self is center. and margin left is auto. No, margin left is 1 EM. And the font size is also 1 EM. Okay, so this looks a little bit better. We have the welcome banana. It's actually maybe kind of too big given how small that is. So let's try that 1.5 here. And then we have our logout button, which takes place of the login button. Although the login button is actually big, so maybe we should not align the logout button. Okay, maybe that looks fine. So we have welcome banana. We have our edit profile. So we can do some changes in here and then go back to the home. And now we have like a flexbox. So you can use flexbox in a lot of different places, not just for menus. So for example, with our posts, you could use a flexbox here. Right now I'm doing the image using this like position absolute. But one thing I could do is I could just take the whole post and say display flex, and then I could use flex on the image. So I could say, you know, the image, I could do the margin left is auto to get the image over there. And then I could take my post and say, you know, align items center. And so I can actually do a lot of, I can replace a ton of previous code just with a few lines of flexbox. So it's a lot nicer than some of the ways that we designed with CSS in the past. So let's actually, that looks pretty good. Let's put that in and then we'll be done for this part. So I'm gonna go to post.css, and this whole profile image, I have all this crap in here that I really don't need. So if I want to get rid of that, I can take out all of this stuff and just say display is flex for the posts. You could also use grid here, but I think this will be nicer. So now all our images are stuck up here. We can get rid of that by just deleting this. Okay, we actually didn't want to delete all of that. It's just this positioning part. Okay, so now we have our image here, but since we're display flex, to move the image over, I can just say margin left is auto. Okay, that's one way to do it. Another thing I could do without even touching the image is just say align or justify content and do space between. So that'll add space in between the two elements. And so there we go. That could be your new post. Let's see. And then we probably don't need as much padding as before, or maybe we could just add the padding on the text instead of the image. What if we do that? I'll move this padding down to the text. Okay, so that kind of looks better. Maybe you'd add a little padding there, or maybe that's fine. We're happy with that. So the flexbox really gives you a lot of stuff that you can do where you can save a lot of time with your other designs just by doing a couple rules here. So that's another place where you can take advantage of the flexbox. All right, so I think that's pretty good. The site is looking a lot more interesting now, at least a lot more modern. So I'm going to stop here, and in the next video, I'll be talking about the responsive layouts using media queries.